Thank you. Could I thank you very much, Yvonne? Could I go to Rushanara now, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm going to start my questions with looking at the differential impact of COVID on different groups. And I wanted to start off with a question to Professor Lowe, given your work in this territory, and obviously other commentators who've talked about the impact on women, ethnic minorities, poorer people, and so on. And there's a trend in recessions; they tend to be often the worst hit. Could you talk us through what sort of interventions would be particularly beneficial for those groups, and also reflect on today's announcements and which ones are going to be particularly helpful to those groups of people who are affected?
So I start to think about how different groups are impacted. I think it's helpful to think about the impact on earnings as distinct from the impact on income and living standards. So if I think about earnings as being about what's the impact on jobs people have got and their employment and so on, and then the impact on their income or living standards is really about how well are they able to mitigate those shocks. I think it's really important to distinguish between those two things. So I can imagine that there are people who are heavily affected by the earning shocks, but who are able to mitigate those shocks because they've got access to savings, they've got access to borrowing, or they've got access to family. So I think it's important we don't just think about what's the impact on earnings, but we also think about how well people are able to mitigate those shocks. And I think what we see is that people's ability to mitigate shocks is very different across the distribution. So I think if I think about the gender differences, just as a kind of starting point, so we don't find, if I just did a kind of raw split of what's the impact on earnings across men and women, we don't find that much of a difference. That's not where the difference is really coming. Where the real difference comes is when we split by whether you've got single parents or you've got couples, and then you do see a much bigger impact. And so I think that my concern about some of this is that we see that single parents are being much more of a cost because of the caring responsibilities, and also they're more likely to be requesting furlough, and they're more likely to be reducing their hours of work. And so I think the question then is, how well are they protected, given that's what's happening? And I think that for them, what's important is coming back to how generous is the tax credit scheme, how much we actually doing in terms of childcare facilities. Are we actually thinking about how to mitigate those direct losses? So I think that's one of the key things which we are finding in terms of our impact, in terms of gender. But so I think one thing I want to stress is it is more nuanced than just saying women are being more impacted than men. I think there's a big difference according to
certainly, of course, it's a given, isn't it, that there's a class differential and so on as well, and the same will apply. There'll be similar issues with other groups. So can you just list quickly which other groups, taking into account the nuances, are particularly hit hard by this crisis?
So
and then I want to move on to Lord Macpherson.
Sure, so to be very quick then. So I think that the other striking things are the people who are in the bottom income quintile and the second income quintile are the ones who are most hit hardest. The other thing we find is there's a big ethnicity difference. And there's a big ethnicity difference in particular in furloughing. So we see that if ethnic minority groups are more likely to be made unemployed rather than furloughed. And so that was one of the kind of striking things we found. Right. So I think that it's that those are the kind of main groups which I think of as being affected. It's single mothers, it's the bottom two income quintiles, and it's ethnic groups. And there's some, of course, there's a cross-cutting thing across occupations. Occupations matter. But in terms of the individual characteristics, I think that's what's important. It is those characteristics.
Great, thank you very much. Lord Macpherson, earlier on you talked about increasing support in universal credit, and yet last week we saw the government introducing sanctions again. And so in terms of what you might have done, advise ministers to do if you were still running the Treasury, what do you think, given what you've heard about the impact on certain groups? And also, let's be clear, we've seen very high prevalence of deaths certainly in my constituency, fourth highest standardized death rates, the highest among Bangladeshis, as well as other minority groups. And we've all been seen effects in our constituencies. And you mentioned austerity and certain groups having to pay the price of it, not in your words, mine. So what would you have advised ministers to do this time that would be different from, say, the Osborne chancellorship in terms of addressing and learning from what's happened and how we move forward to tackle these differential impacts on certain groups in our country?
Well, I mean, the first point I would make is the point about implementation. Back in 2009, I think it's quite possible that the Brown government would have wanted to do something about benefits, but the implementation lag was so long, 6 months to a year, that it just wasn't seen as a particularly effective instrument of demand. That seems to have changed with universal credit. I've been really impressed by the speed with which it's been possible to channel money through it. So, I mean, I just have this sense that the elderly have had a very good run on social security in Britain over the last 10 years. Those of working age, particularly those with larger families, have taken quite a big hit. Now there may be wider public policy reasons for doing that, although I'm still struck that when I signed on back in 1978 as a teenager, I think I got more benefit then in real terms than you would get now. So I just think, as part of a civilized society, it is worth looking at that. But as a former Treasury official, obviously, I would be worried about the cost and embedding extra costs. This isn't something you can mess about on a temporary basis.
Sure, but I think just picking up on Professor Lowe's points, it's single parents. Now, it's politically for some difficult to. Some find it difficult to support single parents. I mean, there's a long history of the way single parents have been treated. Childcare hasn't featured in today's announcements that I can see. What specifically do you think the government should be doing? Looking towards a later statement, what's been done today is many of these interventions are welcome. What else needs to be done in order to mitigate the 9% potential unemployment rate, possibly up to 15% if we have a second wave? And what would you be looking for in a later statement? I think it would be good to have some concrete suggestions on what else should be done. In the current climate, what's been certainly useful is interventions in this committee from experts or former permanent secretaries that can be fed into our ministers and so on. So it'd be very helpful to have a list. What would you do? You've mentioned some of those things, but some more specifics on what needs to happen to mitigate this big challenge that's coming.
Well, I think childcare is a really important issue. There are a whole lot of reasons for that. I'm embarrassed to say that it's 4 years since I left the Treasury, and I no longer am an expert in the details of universal credit. If we were back in sort of the year 2000, when I was in charge of welfare reform in the Treasury, I would have been seeking to increase the childcare tax credit. But I don't know whether that exists anymore within universal credit. But childcare is expensive. I think it's fair to say that the COVID crisis has hit parents with caring responsibilities pretty hard, especially if they are living in, relatively small units of accommodation. So I do think, as a matter of social policy, but also actually because I still firmly believe that work is the best route out of poverty, for employment policy reasons, I think this is something which needs to be looked at, and maybe as part of the budget in the autumn, the Chancellor will act.
Bridget, did you want to add anything on these points? If not, I'm going to move to you for my next section.
It's not my area of expertise, but I have looked at childcare costs in the past, and I think that is a problem generally, and particularly in London. in order to improve people's ability to work, and it's something that we looked at when I was at the GLA.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yes,
So I'm just trying to...
Sorry, Hamish, were you trying to quickly
I was just going to come in to say that I think what the striking difference is with the response in Denmark and in the Scandinavian countries in terms of their support for childcare. I think we should take a lot of lessons for how, in those situations, actually enabling people to get back to work, offering long parental leave, and yet then having heavily subsidized return to work, is shown to have these long-term benefits in terms of employment. That was my only point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So moving on to the theme, continuing with sort of work and employment, can perhaps, Bridget, you could start. What's your overall sense of where infrastructure can be, job-rich infrastructure can be encouraged? You've talked I'm not going to use shovel-ready, but where are the areas where there have been already references to areas where you could intervene? Where can we have infrastructure where we're going to boost employment?
I think we've already mentioned
for now. You've mentioned a few, but are there any additional ones you wanted to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've already mentioned generally supporting the construction industry where it is possible to respond best. But I think we also need to think about these in the longer term as to how infrastructure investment is supporting productivity growth and economic growth more generally by both by connectivity, but also improving our route to zero carbon, for example, and investing in the potential of hydrocarbons, hydrogen and hydrogen potential for decarbonizing gas. So that is a potential both for high job richness in the transition, but also improving our long-term prospects as an economy. Anybody who is old enough, as I certainly am, to remember the transition to a North Sea gas and a huge replacement of boilers and so on, which was an incredibly job-rich thing. There was a period where solar panels was also a very job-rich infrastructure movement, and indeed moved to zero carbon. Lots of firms popped up to implement that, and it was spread all over the country as well. So it was also very much able to respond right up, not just in some parts of the country. So those sorts of areas, I think. Electric vehicle charging is another implementation. Rollout of broadband, full fibre to the premises. All of these are both job rich in their implementation. Plans already exist, and indeed they create a better focus for the economy long term.
So one more for you around this, which is, have we got the correct architecture for training, apprenticeships, skills development in the context of what was mentioned earlier by the former PermSec about Brexit? Some of my colleagues won't like me mentioning the B word, but the reality is London, for instance, one example, we rely on a lot of EU nationals in the construction sector. Are we ready for that? And will today's announcements on investment and support to young people actually help or hinder the apprenticeship program? Because why would employers switch to the Kickstart program, which I welcome, but why would they switch to the Kickstart program would they not switch from apprenticeships to Kickstart? Are there some unintended impacts that could be negative, or is it all?
There may be. To be honest, I haven't really looked enough at the detail to know whether that's a really serious risk or not. So I can't really answer that question, I'm afraid. I would say, however, are we ready with training? No. Have we ever been ready with training? I mean, my whole career, we've been spending time saying we don't have a good enough vocational training system. I can't really answer the question as to why in all that time we haven't been able to. I wish I could give you
of yours.
I wish I could. I don't know how.
These ex-students of yours who went off to be ministers.
Yeah, clearly that was
okay. So we've got to do more. What ahead of a budget statement, what would you expect or would hope the government could do very quickly to meet that challenge? Given everything's we're having to do everything at a speed of lightning. The Treasury has demonstrated it's able to speed things up and do things faster than ever before. So perhaps for you and Lord Macpherson, what else would you expect or hope they could do to speed this up? Because otherwise, infrastructure is all very well, but if you don't have the workers, if you don't have people ready for it, then it's going to be pointless, isn't it?
Well, I think there are two specific things you could do. Firstly, you can really put some welly behind the colleges of training in specific areas in infrastructure like railways and so on that have been set up, and really give them some visibility and work hard, as I'm sure some other people do too, and I try to support STEM education in schools and get people into those at an earlier stage, improve the visibility of women in engineering. All of these things we need to, there's no one thing, there's no silver bullet for this. If there were, we'd have found it by now. Every aspect of this needs to be supported, and we need to make sure that those kinds of careers are seen as valuable. If you go to Germany, being an engineer is a good thing. France, Germany, an engineer is a good thing. Here, what's an engineer? No.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. So one question each to well, I'll start with Professor Lowe. If you could, just anything else you want to add, if we look at the scale of what we're dealing with, and the potential for unemployment, obviously 1 million young people who face unemployment by the end of the year. And despite the current program today that's been introduced, it's for 6 months. It's comparable to the Future Jobs Fund, but some would argue we need something much more ambitious for a longer period of time for young people. And then you've got the overall unemployment rate. What else would you propose happens in the context of potentially another health crisis later on in the year if social distancing doesn't, if we have similar spikes that other countries are showing signs of?
So I think a couple of comments. So one is, if I think of why we've got such a problem with the young in unemployment, is because of the narrowness of where they're being employed. The kind of focus on the hospitality sector, the focus on the retail sector, that's where we're hit. And so when those sectors have been hit, we've seen this implication for young individuals. And so we're trying, and I think the measures we put in place are trying to prop them up in those sectors. And I think we have to find ways of shifting them across sectors. And the problem is, this is not a solution which is going to be achieved in 6 months. It's back to Bridget's point about why we ended up in this situation we're in now, is because we haven't, every time this comes up, we're saying, oh, well, it's a long-term issue training, and we're not actually serious about training the bottom 50% of the population. And so I think that I don't have a magic solution for what we should be doing at Christmas time, when this all kind of ends and when it's all going wrong. But I do think we should now be making that commitment to a 5-year plan on how we're actually going to stop the dependency of young people on the hospitality and the retail sectors. And I do think that one of the things I would not have done was to try to bolster hospitality and retail in the way that's happened, because that doesn't help with the sort of realignment that we'd actually want to happen with younger individuals. And that's why I think having a more wider wage subsidy scheme would actually have a much more beneficial effect in allowing us reallocating towards sectors which have got more long-term future with genuine job progression.
Yeah. So you would have put wage subsidy instead of Kickstart today if you were
the Kickstart program, and we know the evaluation from when the Labour government did it, that actually this was a pretty effective short-run thing. It's not, and it did have this ongoing benefits. And I think so. I'm completely in favour of the Kickstart program.
You might put in this other idea as a second stage, as the sort of next step, if you like. Okay.
Exactly. And brilliant. Instead of the coronavirus, the ongoing furloughing job retention payment scheme.
So Lord Macpherson, you get the last word in my section. One of the concerns is that some people would say, even a Labour MP might say, the Treasury's response has been much more rapid. It's been responsive to some of the challenges around, for instance, introducing the job retention scheme and others. Credit where it's due. It's been quicker to respond to some challenges. We have lots of criticisms, of course, about other areas, which you would have heard. But there's a disjuncture between what's happening in health and the mismanagement, actually, in terms of testing, PPE, tracking, and these are interdependent to economic recovery and what we do. To what extent is the health response and pandemic response continues to be the sort of weakest link to the government strategy? And what do you think we need to learn from that experience to ensure that poor handling of the health crisis, especially if we get a second wave, doesn't undermine the effort to recover, and we don't go back into lockdown, we don't go back into retreat in terms of trying to recover on the economic side?
Well, I can't really speak for the Department for Health, but I think that the lesson I learned from 2008, 2009 is, and in one sense, it's very lucky. Well, it's not lucky because no one will want this to happen, but it's lucky that the Treasury, that the people running the Treasury, Tom Scholar and so on, were at the heart of that crisis. So they have the experience, the knowledge to act quickly, and also the evidence base. And I think it should be incumbent on all government departments which go through really difficult times to really try and distill the knowledge and then embed it. And I hope even now the Department for Health, I know there have been some missteps, but they've also done some good things. And I hope as they're going along, they are learning the lessons. And you know, I don't want to get into some wider discussion about the civil service, and I was very impressed by Mr. Gove's speech the other day, which showed remarkable knowledge, not least of Gramsci's writing. But you know, it's really important that that Mr. Gove and others practice what they preach. Expertise matters.
Mm.
Great, thank you very much.
Good note to end on. Thank you very much, Lord McPherson.
Okay, thank you. And going finally to Angela, please.